A Mediterranean Mystery by Fred E. Wynne. Chapter 5. What the Little Steamer Brought. It was clearly impossible for me to make the real acquaintance of the Astorchi that night, and as it was certainly raw and cold on deck in the dark, I gladly followed Captain Welfare down the companion to the saloon. Here I found a most unexpected scene of comfort and civilization. Most of my limited experience of yachting had been gained in small boats, and I had foolishly modelled my anticipation of the Astarte on my recollections of these. So I was surprised at the width and spaciousness I found. A powerful lamp, deeply shaded in red and suspended from the skylight, lit up the table, which was laid for some sort of late evening meal. There were deep red tulips in vases, and a pleasant gleam of silver and cut glass on the white cloth. The chairs, of course, were of the morine type, fixed in the floor with revolving seats. Over the lockers along each side were deep luxurious seats, upholstered in dull red morocco, and over these, between the wide portholes, each panel was filled with a pictorial tile of dwellt ware with a singularly clean and restful decorative effect of blues and browns. The further bulkhead on either side of the narrow door leading forward was filled with bookcases, a soft Persian carpet on the curving sides of the ship, the cunning shelves and cupboards that occupied odd corners, all combined to produce that air of coziness that can be found nowhere in such perfection as in a ship's cabin. Captain Welfare was openly delighted by my praises of all these arrangements. There was something comical, though pathetic, in his anxiety for my approval. In fact, I began to fear that his apologetic attitude would become a little wearisome if he persisted in it. Thus he apologized for the leather upholstering and entered into a long explanation of the reasons for the absence of velvet. It was in vain that I assured him with the utmost sincerity that I greatly preferred leather. He simply did not listen. It was evident that he himself considered that red velvet cushions would have done me more honor, and really deplored their absence. My protestations he regarded as mere politeness, and he was concerned only in his own explanations. In the same spirit he kept apologizing for the absence of many things which I should have loathed had they been there. My cabin had been newly furnished throughout, and I found something very touching in the almost ladylike care which had been spent upon it. I had for some time realized that, as Edmund had said he would, Captain Welfare regarded me as a swell, and simply because I was quite unconscious of being anything of the sort, he had conceived a queer kind of devotion to me. Like the great majority of mankind, both Welfare and Edmund were pleasantest when acting as hosts. Especially Edmund, because his pride in the ship was gratified by my real pleasure in it, and he was of course free from that well meant but fussy solicitude that is so common in hosts, and so very wearing for the guest. After our early unhurried meal, the supper on board was most acceptable. The Astarte was footing pleasantly before the fair wind with very little motion, and as we chatted in the warm light of the saloon, I felt that my holiday was going to be a great success. "When do you expect to reach Guernsey?" I asked. "If this breeze holds, we shall be there the morning after tomorrow at latest," said Captain Welfare. "But we can't count on it this time of year. It may fall calm any minute. Then it will be a matter of luck with the tides and what bits of wind we can catch." "I'm in no hurry," I said with a sense of luxurious freedom. "I rather hope we shall be delayed." "Well, we will be a few days in Guernsey anyhow, and then I want to go on to Jersey. I hope that will be quite convenient to you, Mr. Devon." "I shall be delighted." If you call at Alderney and Sark and all the rest of them, it will be all right to me. I've heard from my correspondent in Jersey, said Captain Welfare, with a little grandiloquence. With a bit of cargo there we might as well bring back. It will help to pay our expenses. That's delightful. The touch of business takes away all the sense of futility one usually has on a yacht. Yes, said Edmund, going to look at places and photograph them simply because everyone else has labeled them pretty or picturesque or interesting or something. That kind of yachtsman is only an expensive kind of tripper after all. I've had good times on a yacht too, I must admit, I said with a retrospective sigh. And I never have, said Edmund with sudden bitterness. I've had to watch other people, ladies and asses in white flannels, floating into a harbour on some millionaire cheesemonger's 1,000-tonner, while I've stood, black to the eyes, watching the Dago's coal ship, or punching niggers on some bit of a trading scow. It's simply a case of sour grapes with me, old man. He ended with a laugh that grated on me. It was a cynical laugh, very unlike the Edmund of old, and yet, I felt, typical of much that I had noticed in his bearing since he had been home this time. I did not like to think of him having been driven to envy mere prosperous, idle people, and I was sure there was something deeper in his resentment than common jealousy of idleness and wealth. The bishop's words came back to me with painful force. There is nothing worse for a gentleman than to be déclassé. And with this there recurred my old wonder what it was that Edmund had surrendered. I don't think you need envy anybody while you're on the Astarte, I said quietly. How? I haven't a word to say against the Astarte, Edmund admitted. Captain Welfare leaned back with a sigh of relief. He had watched Edmund anxiously during his momentary discontent. Indeed, I had noticed that he often seemed uneasy when Edmund expressed any dissatisfaction, as though some restraint were needed to keep him in the partnership. I attributed this merely to the want of steadfastness I knew so well in Edmund. Of course, he said, as of an explanation, we have not always been on the Astarte. We had some rough times before we got her, as you know, sir. But if things go as well as they are doing for another 3 years, you will be able to have your own yacht, Mr. Edmund, and bother no more about cargoes. I shan't want it then. Once I'm independent of trade, I shall want to stick to it. This was of course unintelligible to Captain Welfare, with his ideal of retiring, but I understood perfectly. I said to myself, the bishop was right. Edmund must have some service to perform as soon as possible. A tremendous sleepiness came upon me, and early as it was, I said good night and turned in. I was on deck betimes next morning and found the sun well up in a clear blue April morning sky. The Astarte was foaming along very gaily, with free sheets, two big square sails set on her foremast, and all her headsails drawing. There was a fair amount of following sea, from which she lifted her short counter with exhilarating buoyancy. She struck me as bigger and more of a ship than I had expected. The bulwarks round the afterdeck were nearly breast high, as she had a great deal of free board for her size. There was a kind of short waist amidships covering the hold and a small deck over the forecastle. Her slightly raking masts and Lego mutton sails looked a tremendous height from the deck, and the whole boat seemed to taper away to the great sloping bowsprit with its flight of jibs. I thought, what a weird-looking craft she must be from outside, but I realized that her lines, though strange, must be beautiful. Her decks were holystoned and scrubbed to the whiteness of paper, and the thin lines of caulking between the planks had the polish of jet. The inside of the bulwarks and other parts were newly painted in green and white, and the mahogany and brass of the skylights, the wheel and binnacle, all shone with the lustre of well-tended furniture. Two or three of the crew were busy about the deck, their bare legs shining like brown silk stockings, their bright exotic costumes, and dark faces with teeth flashing as they grinned and chattered at their work, gave me a queer feeling of having been transported in my sleep to the unknown East. One of them was a thin, delicate creature with a skin of the color and polish of black lead, a Sudanese, as I afterwards learned. The wheel was a little abaft of the saloon companion. It was in charge of a tall, gracefully built Arab in a handsome blue linen galabai. As we were practically before the wind, there was little strain on the wheel, which he handled delicately and instinctively with one hand. The soft fez at the back of his head was bound with the green of a descendant of the Prophet. His lean brown face had an essential air of aristocracy and command in its repose. Only his accipitrine eyes seemed alert, intent on everything from the horizon to the details of the work of the man nearest him. He reminded me irresistibly of a half-tamed falcon on a perch. I guessed this must be Jacob, who had sat next us in the boat, but whom I could not be said to have seen, and to whom I had not yet spoken. "Said Effendi," he said gravely as I approached him. He made his dignified salam, touching his forehead, lips, and breast with a gesture that surprised me, for it was so like the Christian ceremony of crossing one's self. "Good morning," I said. "Do you speak English?" "I speak all the languages. They are alike to me." "You are Jacob?" I knew no other name for him, but I was honestly afraid of being unduly familiar in addressing him by his, whatever the Mohammedan equivalent of a Christian name may be. "I'm your Excellency's servant, Jacob," he said. He seemed to wait for me to continue the conversation if I wanted to, but would evidently be quite unembarrassed if no more were said. I uttered the usual futility about the morning. "It is, sir, very beautiful," he replied. "Your English sea can be sometimes beautiful, but it is not so often." He politely offered me the wheel, asking if I would like to steer. I took it from him. Being better used to a tiller, I did not at first find my touch, and allowed a following sea to break square on our counter. A heavy dash of spray wetted us both, but Jacob only smiled politely at my vexation. It was then that I began to hate him. His manner was polite, in fact obsequious, but from the beginning of our acquaintance I felt that he regarded me as a sort of joke, as something utterly negligible. In the covert insolence of his handsome face, I thought I read too that where I were in his way he would see me thrown overboard as if I were a rat. I wondered at Edmund's easy-going toleration of such a man. This was, however, my only disagreeable impression on board the Astarte, and as I had no occasion to see the man, it soon passed from my mind as I fell into the mood of the cheerfully passing hours aboard ship. The weather kept fine, and the breeze held throughout the day and the night. Intent on picking up a little colloquial Arabic, I spent a good deal of time talking to the Arab who acted as waiter and servants in the saloon. Although I had never before heard the language spoken, I had in the course of my researches gained some little acquaintance with the terrors of Arabic grammar and even some vocabulary which I now found I pronounced all wrong. It was a relief to find that the extraordinary complexities of the language, as written by scholars, disappeared from the tongue as spoken, and I hoped it would not be impossible to compass a passable imitation of their weird gutturals and deep chest tones. Hassan, as our servant was called, professed to be astonished at my proficiency, and I was encouraged by finding that I could soon pick out some words and phrases in listening to the jabber of the Arab crew. Edmund was often able to help me in points I could not well explain to Hassan, although he averred he only knew enough of the language to curse the niggers in. To Captain Welfare, any progress was miraculous. He said that to have been able to speak and understand the language would once have been worth £1,000 to him, but he had been told it was derived from camel talk and had not believed it was possible for a Christian to learn it. He had all the ignorant Englishman's feeling that there is something undignified in using any language spoken by what he calls generically natives, which is curiously mingled with profound respect for anyone else who can do it. It was on our second morning out that I found Captain Welfare on deck before me. "That's Alderney," he said, pointing to a long, low coastline just visible on our port bow. "Already?" I asked. "We seem hardly to have started." "I'm glad it's not been tedious, sir, but we're a good way from Guernsey yet. The wind's inclined to south a bit though, and if it goes a few more points we will get our square sails set again. Then if it holds we will be there or thereabouts tonight or tomorrow morning." "Well, I'm in no hurry to get there, as I said." "That's maybe just as well. You never know your luck at sea in a sailing boat." By midday I was watching the sea break over the famous Cascades, which looked like the jaw of a dog in the water. We went down to luncheon and were just having our coffee after the meal when the saloon door opened and Jacob came in. This was an unwarranted intrusion, for Jacob had neither the status of a guest nor a servant, and etiquette is necessarily rigid at sea. I saw Welfare flush angrily and look at him with astonishment in his round bright eyes. "What the devil—" began Edmund. Jacob looked at him quite impassively and said a few words in Arabic which I did not understand. I saw Edmund look startled. "Get away on deck, and I will follow you in a minute," he said. Jacob gravely salaamed and left, carefully closing the door. "What's the matter?" asked Welfare. "I'm just going to see. Nothing much, I expect," Edmund replied, but I thought there was a note of anxiety in his voice. "Infernal cheek of him walking in here, whatever it is," grumbled Welfare. "Yes, of course," Edmund agreed. "He should have given his message to Hassan." I was enjoying the situation, taking the cowardly pleasure that one does when a man one dislikes incurs the blame of people one suspects of supporting him. I had felt I was in a minority in my resentment of Jacob, and now I tasted the craven joy of having others on my side. "Excuse me," said Edmund as he finished his coffee and he went on deck. "I hope there's nothing wrong," I said to Welfare. "Oh, there can't be anything wrong exactly. A bit of a scrape among some of the crew, I dare say." In spite of his words he looked uneasy as he lit a cigarette. "Don't let me keep you if you want to go up," I said. "Perhaps I might as well have a look." He followed Edmund and I was left alone. There were no unusual sounds, nor any sign of alteration in the weather. I felt that if it was only some matter of the ship's discipline, they would prefer me to remain below. I drank another cup of coffee, but then curiosity overcame my scruples and I went on deck. A little dirty steamer had come up to within a quarter of a mile of us. One of those tiny nondescript things that knock about near harbours, with a bit of deck forward and a funnel right in the stern making a vast amount of black smoke. Someone on her deck was handing down a string of signal flags as I came up, and I noticed that our course was altered so as to bring us right down to her. There was nothing else to be seen save the spouts of foam over the Cascades now far astern. Captain Welfare, Edmund, and Jacob were leaning on the port bulwarks, watching the little vessel, and then Edmund came past me to take the wheel from one of the Arabs. "What's up?" I asked. "It's a letter from the people in Guernsey. I don't know what they want." The wheel was put over a few spokes, the crew paid out some of the main and foresheets, and the Astarte went foaming down wildly to leeward of the steamer. I heard the clink-clang of the steamer's engine signal, and her noisy propeller stopped. Then our wheel was put hard over, the big booms came aboard with a swing, and the Astarte came into the wind with a tremendous flapping of her head sails. Her way took her within a few yards of the steamer, and as the helm was put over again, she slid slowly along her lee. A man on the dirty little bridge gave us a hail and swung out a small packet attached to a light line which was neatly caught by Jacob. "All right?" he hailed in English. "All right." The steamer's skipper rang his engines on again, the Astarte gathered her way, and the two boats parted with a wave of the hand from the man on the bridge. I saw Captain Welfare cut the canvas wrappings from the packet that had been thrown aboard. He took a letter out, opened it, and glanced at it swiftly. Then he seemed to me that he looked across the deck at myself with an expression of regretful perplexity on his great heavy face. It occurred to me that this was how he would look if he had to announce to me that someone very dear to me were dead. But at the same time I knew I was the one member of the party who could not be affected by the news, whatever it might be. Still holding his letter in both hands and glancing at it, Captain Welfare walked across to Edmund and spoke to him. Edmund nodded, called Jacob, and handed over the wheel to him. Then they both disappeared down the companion. I set down all these details as minutely as I can remember them, because it is from them that I have since had to piece together in my mind all that was happening during this time when I had no clue to their meaning. I had no mind to speak to Jacob, and stood leaning over the bulwark watching the lessening smudge of black smoke that represented the little steamer. Edmund had left us sailing with free sheets on our course to Guernsey, so I was surprised on looking up to see the crew getting in sheets, while Jacob put us on a course close hull to windward. I surprised a look in Jacob's face, as though he were waiting for some sign of uneasiness on my part. His face was more than usually insolent, I thought, so I merely looked up along the leach of the sail, till the tremor died from it as the Astarte settled to her new work. Then I returned to my former posture and waited 10 minutes by my watch before I went below. The saloon was empty, but I heard voices from Welfare's cabin, which had room for a good-sized table in it, and served as a kind of office and chart room. I lay down on one of our delightfully comfortable locker couches with a novel I had been trying to get interested in. The steady motion of the boat and the soft diffused light that came down from the skylight were very soothing. The book was one that Captain Welfare regarded as a masterpiece of literature. He would not be satisfied until I had read and praised it. I was conscientiously trying to do the former, and intended afterwards to praise it without consulting my conscience. It was one of those novels that people write again and again, like the pictures that turn up season after season at the Academy, Nymphs Bathing, Autumn's Fiery Finger, and the like. I forget whether this book was about Cavaliers and Roundheads or the French Revolution. But very soon I began to be interested in the patterns made by the spaces between the printed words. They seemed to run in wavy lines down the page, and soon the book had lost all power to bore me. Presently I heard the cabin door open, and Edmund and Welfare came out, speaking in low tones. "You will have to tell him," Edmund was saying. "But what am I to say?" "Stick to what we arranged. You must chalk it all down to Jacob." I perceived from their voices that they thought I was asleep, and though their conversation had conveyed no meaning to me, I did not want to overhear more. I coughed and sat up. "I hope we have not disturbed you?" Welfare asked, looking, I thought, a little guilty. "Not at all, but I'm afraid I have dozed a little over this most interesting book. It's the sea air and the motion. quite so, said Captain Welfare solemnly. Edmund said nothing and went on deck. Captain Welfare sat down facing me in one of the revolving chairs on the opposite side of the table. His eyes looked distressful in the midst of his great cicatrix of a face, and I noticed perspiration on his forehead and upper lip. I hope there's nothing wrong, I said. Well, we've had some rather upsetting news. Nothing wrong exactly, but upsetting. It alters our plans a bit. I was just going to tell you. Me and Mr. Edmund have been talking things over a bit. His big right hand was pinching up creases in the tablecloth and setting it all crooked in a maddening way. Well, I said interrogatively, I don't often drink between meals, Mr. Devon, but I think I will have a brandy and soda if you don't mind. Of course, I said, as he touched the gong on the table and gave his instructions to Hassan. Perhaps you will join me? He asked hopefully. I elected to have some whisky so as to put him a little more at his ease, for he was perturbed to an extent that was quite distressing. I anticipated nothing but some trouble, possibly some loss, in connection with the business, and was chiefly anxious to know whether Jacob had been authorized to alter our course. Captain Welfare swallowed about half of his brandy and soda and mopped his forehead, still regarding me with a look of perplexity and distress. Yes, he said, as though continuing a conversation. Yes, we will have to give Guernsey a miss. How? Are you going straight to Jersey, then? In the back of my mind I knew that the course we were on was taking us away from the one island as fast as from the other, but I had not thought it out, and felt there must be some way of accounting for the manoeuvre. No, I'm afraid we will have to give Jersey a miss too. In fact, we will have to cut out the islands altogether this trip. Really? That's very disappointing. Are we going straight back? How no? No, we will not go back for a bit. Well, where on earth are we going, Captain Welfare? Captain Welfare slowly finished his drink and looked as if he were pondering the advisability of taking another. He finally put his glass down a little tremulously. The fact is, you saw this message come aboard? Yes. Well, it seems we are wanted out east at once. Very urgent. There's nothing for it but to make all sail and get there. Out east? The Mediterranean, you know, the old beat. But that will take weeks. We should do it in a month with luck, if the weather holds. And where are you going to put me off? We were just talking about that, me and Mr. Edmund. You wouldn't think well of making the trip with us, I suppose? That's quite out of the question. I only arranged to be away for 2 or 3 weeks. It will be a bit warm out there, of course, but not bad really, especially at sea and the worst of the Campsians. That's the hot winds, you know, will be over. But, Captain Welfare, I don't care about the climate there, for I'm not going. It's impossible. I must ask you to call at Cornsay or somewhere and put me off. Then I could get back to Southampton. I shall be very sorry to leave the boat, but there's nothing else for it. It's the time, Mr. Devon. It might mean missing our markets. We can't afford to take any chances. I don't profess to know much about trade. You don't, sir. You don't know anything about it. That's what makes it so hard to explain. All the same, I don't see how a delay of 24 hours or less in a month's voyage is going to make such a vital difference as all that. That's just it, Mr. Devon. You don't see it. You can't. No, and therefore I demand to be landed at Guernsey. After all, I'm a partner. To be sure, sir. Nobody questions your right. But well, the fact is we can't call it Guernsey. It's not only missing our markets, but we should lose Jacob. Jacob? That would be no great loss, in my opinion. But what has he got to do with it? I'm afraid Jacob hasn't a very good record. We knew that, of course, when we took him on. I think Mr. Edmund told you. He did, and my own impression is that he's the biggest scoundrel unhung. I wouldn't be a bit surprised, but he's extraordinarily useful to us just at present. I don't know what we should do without him. Then they would want us to give evidence, and you don't know what the Egyptian courts are for delay, and worse things. But what is it all about? For the Lord's sake, man, tell me straight what's happened. I was just going to. It seems he's wanted by the Egyptian police, and they have traced him on to the Astarte and have warrants out for him all over the place. They might put the ship under arrest, and that would simply ruin us. We've got to get him back to Egypt, sir. We can get rid of him there, and we cannot get rid of him any nearer home. There was an air of finality in his tone which warned me I must try to preserve my dignity, even if bereft of my liberty. I think this is a matter that ought to be discussed between all three of us, I said. Do you mind if I send Hassan to ask my brother to join us? Not at all. I'll go myself, said Welfare with an air of intense relief. For the time being, the thought uppermost in my mind was the anxiety of Bates and Mrs. Rattray at my absence. I had not been long enough away, not far enough, for the home foreground to recede. Edmund came in, looking to my surprise more cheerful and jollier than he had done for a long time. Well, he said, I suppose welfare's broken it to you? Ha, I see you've been drinking to the cruise. I'll join you. Hassan, get another glass. I'm really jolly glad, old man, you're coming. You will simply love the Mediterranean. It seems to me, I said, with a sincere attempt at austerity, that I am being taken to the Mediterranean against my will in order to help a criminal to elude justice. Only temporarily, said Edmund. Nothing could keep Jacob from the gallows in the long run. This kind of thing may be all very well for you, but in my position, I know, it wouldn't be considered good form in a clergyman, but I assure you nothing will ever come of it at home. We are not going east of Suez where there ain't no 10 Commandments, but to Egypt and the Levant where there are so many commandments that nobody can remember them all or bother very much. Besides, you have no responsibility in the matter anyhow. You forget I'm part owner of this boat. We will make that all right. We will sign a declaration that you have been shanghaied and brought along under protest. You will sign, Welfare? Certainly, if Mr. Davron thinks it necessary. I don't want anything of the sort. But you must see it is impossible for me to be so long away from the parish. Why, we heard the bishop telling you to stop away as long as you liked, and it will be a godsend for that poor fellow Snape. How? He won't object, I know, but Bates and Mrs. Rattray will be frantic with anxiety, and all my letters unanswered. We don't suppose it's convenient, but on the other hand, there's the chance of making a clear 2,000. Welfare and I can't afford to risk losing that. £2,000? I wish you had let me go back to Guernsey in the boat that brought the message. I never thought of that, said Captain Welfare. Naturally. We didn't know what the message was. It wouldn't have done anyhow. No, it's far better as it is. The only thing now is to have as good a time as we can. So here's luck. And I hope you won't feel as if any constraint was put on you, sir, said Captain Welfare with profound solemnity. Edmund and I both laughed, and in the laugh was my capitulation. I can't feel that, Captain Welfare, as long as you do nothing to prevent me swimming home. Captain Welfare held out his hand and took mine gravely. Mr. Davron, he said, I wouldn't have had this happen for a great deal. I don't know how to thank you for taking it as you do, sir. It's a great relief. That's all right, said Edmund, and now we will drink prosperity to the trip, and may nothing cheat the gallows of Jacob. End of chapter 5.